May 17, 1940. The Dyle River Valley, Belgium. Pierre Mercier stood in his wheat field watching the horizon burn. The morning sky had turned the color of rust and smoke, and the sound rolling across the valley wasn't thunder. It was artillery. German artillery. And it was getting closer. He was 53 years old, a farmer who had spent his entire life working the same land his father and grandfather had worked before him. His hands were thick and calloused from decades of plowing, his back permanently bent from a lifetime of labor. He knew these fields the way a sailor knows the sea, understood their rhythms and moods, knew where the water pooled after rain and where the earth turned to clay so thick it could swallow a cartwheel. But none of that knowledge seemed to matter now. The German Wehrmacht was coming, and everyone said nothing could stop them. His wife Marie stood in the doorway of their farmhouse, her face pale as she watched the smoke. Their 2 sons were gone. Jean-Paul was somewhere with the Belgian army, though they hadn't heard from him in 3 days. Michel had left that morning with most of the other young men from the village, heading east toward the sound of guns with hunting rifles and whatever else they could carry. Pierre had wanted to go with them. But the mayor had asked him to stay, said someone needed to coordinate the evacuation of the elderly and the children. So he'd watched his youngest son disappear down the road and wondered if he'd ever see him again. Now it was late morning, and the evacuation was complete. Everyone who was leaving had already left. The roads west were clogged with refugees, thousands of them streaming toward Brussels and beyond, carrying what they could on their backs or in carts pulled by exhausted horses. Pierre had been told to leave too, had been urged to abandon his farm and join the flood of humanity fleeing the German advance. But he couldn't do it. This land was everything he had. Every stone in the walls around his property had been placed by hand. Every tree in his small orchard had been planted and tended for years. The thought of simply walking away and letting the Germans take it without resistance felt like a betrayal of everything his family had built. So he'd sent Marie west with their neighbors, promising he would follow soon. And then he'd stood alone in his field, watching the horizon burn and feeling utterly powerless. That's when he noticed the way the wheat was moving. Not from wind. The air was still and heavy. But in the low field near the river, the wheat stalks were swaying slightly, their roots saturated from the morning fog and the previous night's rain. The ground there was always wet this time of year, fed by underground springs that made the soil rich but also treacherous. He'd lost a plow horse there once, the animal's leg punching through the crust into knee-deep mud. Pierre stared at that field, and something shifted in his mind. He thought about the German tanks he'd seen in newsreels, massive steel machines that crushed everything in their path. He thought about how invincible they seemed, how the radio announcers spoke of them with a kind of terrified awe. Unstoppable. Invincible. The future of warfare. And then he thought about that treacherous low field, and about the elaborate system of drainage ditches and irrigation channels that crisscrossed his property, and about the river just 100 meters away, swollen from spring rain. The idea that came to him was absurd. Ridiculous. The kind of thing a desperate man thinks of when he has no real options left. But he was a desperate man. And he had nothing left to lose. The German 9th Panzer Division had been advancing through Belgium for 3 days, and everything was going according to plan. Actually, better than planned. The Belgians were retreating so quickly that the panzers were having trouble keeping up with their own success. Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter commanded the division's lead battalion, and as he stood in the turret of his Panzer III, watching the countryside roll past, he felt almost disappointed. This wasn't the war he'd trained for. There was no glory in chasing an enemy that refused to stand and fight. They'd crossed into Belgium on the 15th, smashing through border fortifications that proved far less formidable than expected. Since then it had been a race, pushing hard through small towns and villages, occasionally exchanging fire with Belgian rearguard units but never meeting serious resistance. The Belgians would fire a few shots, then retreat. Fire and retreat. Over and over. The panzer crews were exhausted from the pace of the advance, but they were also confident. Nothing had stopped them. Nothing could stop them. The Belgian army was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force was scrambling to establish defensive positions somewhere to the west. And the French, well, everyone knew the French were in chaos, unable to coordinate any effective response. Richter's orders were simple: maintain the advance, keep pressure on the retreating Belgians, and secure the crossing at Wavre by nightfall. From there they would push toward Brussels. The city would fall within days. Perhaps hours. Looking at the map spread across his knees, Richter traced their route. The main road ran straight west, but it was clogged with refugees and the remains of Belgian military convoys. His battalion commander had given him permission to take an alternate route through the valley to the south, bypassing the congestion. According to the map, there was a secondary road that ran along the Dyle River, through open farmland. Perfect tank country. They could make excellent time. He gave the order. The column turned south, 37 panzers and supporting vehicles forming a long steel snake that wound through the Belgian countryside. Behind them came infantry, artillery, supply trucks. A complete armored battle group, one of the sharp spearpoints of the German advance. The morning wore on. The panzers rolled through empty villages where shuttered windows watched them pass like dead eyes. They crossed small bridges over nameless streams. They passed abandoned farms where chickens wandered loose in yards and dogs barked at the sound of approaching tanks. Richter checked his watch. They were making excellent time. At this rate they'd reach Wavre 2 hours ahead of schedule. That's when they entered the valley where Pierre Mercier's farm stood alone against the morning sky. Pierre worked with the frantic energy of a man racing against time he didn't have. His plan was insane. He knew that. But it was the only plan he had. The key to everything was water. His farm sat at the bottom of a shallow valley where the Dyle River made a wide bend. Over generations, his family had built an extensive system of irrigation channels to water the fields during dry summers. These channels drew water from the river through a main gate, then distributed it across the property through a network of smaller ditches. But there was another system too, one that Pierre's grandfather had built to drain the fields during wet springs. This system of drainage ditches ran in the opposite direction, collecting water from the low-lying areas and channeling it back to the river downstream. The two systems usually operated independently, controlled by a series of sluice gates and small dams. Usually. But Pierre knew something most people didn't know, something only someone who'd spent a lifetime working this land would understand. If you opened all the gates at once, if you broke down the barriers that separated the irrigation and drainage systems, if you redirected all the water from the river's bend into the low fields instead of the high ones, you could create something extraordinary. You could create a swamp. A temporary one, but deep enough and wide enough to turn solid ground into a trap. Pierre started with the main river gate. It took all his strength to crank open the rusted mechanism, forcing the heavy wooden barriers aside. Water immediately began flowing faster through the main channel, the river eager to fill any space it was given. Then he ran to the high field gates and opened those too, redirecting water away from the elevated areas where it normally went and toward the low fields instead. He used his plow horse and a length of chain to tear out two small dams that normally kept water away from the most saturated areas. He knocked down the earthen berms that protected the wettest sections of his property. And all the while he worked, he could hear the rumble getting closer. Not thunder. Engines. Diesel engines. Dozens of them. The Germans were coming. Pierre ran from gate to gate, opening everything, breaking everything that held water back. His heart hammered in his chest. His hands bled from wrestling with rusted metal and splintered wood. He fell twice in his haste, once badly enough that he thought he'd broken his wrist. But he kept working, driven by desperation and fury and a strange kind of hope that made no sense but kept him moving anyway. The water responded. It always had. This land had wanted to be a swamp for centuries. Human effort had turned it into farmland, but that transformation had always been temporary, maintained only through constant vigilance. Now Pierre was undoing decades of careful water management in less than an hour. And the land remembered what it had been before. The low fields began to flood. Slowly at first, then faster. The water spread across the wheat, turning golden rows into a shimmering mirror. It filled the ancient depressions that Pierre's ancestors had tried to level. It found the hidden springs and magnified them, creating pools that connected and merged and grew. Within 30 minutes, what had been firm ground was knee-deep in water. Within an hour, it was deeper still. Pierre stood on the small hill where his farmhouse sat, the only elevated spot on his property, and watched his fields transform. He'd destroyed everything he'd spent his life building. His wheat was drowning. His irrigation system was ruined. The land would take years to reclaim even if he survived to try. But he'd created something else. Something he hoped the Germans weren't ready for. The rumble of engines grew louder. And then, through the morning haze, Pierre saw them. Tanks. More tanks than he'd ever imagined existed, stretching back along the road in a line that seemed endless. They were heading straight for his farm. Straight for the flooded fields he'd just created. Pierre ducked behind his barn, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. And waited. Oberstleutnant Richter saw the farm ahead and made a quick decision. The road they'd been following was becoming difficult, narrowed by trees and damaged by heavy traffic. But the farmland to their right looked perfect. Open fields, apparently dry, offering excellent visibility and room to maneuver. He radioed his battalion commander. Main road is becoming congested. I'm going to take the column across country through these fields. Should save us 20 minutes. The response came back immediately. Approved. Maintain formation and speed. Richter gave the order. One by one, the panzers turned off the road and into Pierre Mercier's fields. The first tank crossed onto what looked like solid ground with complete confidence. Its weight, 30 tons of steel and armor, was distributed across wide tracks designed to cross soft terrain. The panzer's commander, Hauptmann Wolfgang Beck, barely paid attention to the ground beneath him. He was focused on the horizon, watching for enemy positions, maintaining formation. The panzer rolled forward 50 meters. Then 60. The ground seemed fine, perhaps slightly soft, but nothing unusual for a river valley in spring. Then the tank's left track broke through the surface crust. It happened suddenly. One moment the panzer was moving steadily forward. The next, its left side dropped a foot, the track sinking into mud that hadn't been visible beneath the thin layer of grass and wheat. The engine roared as the driver tried to power through, but the more the track spun, the deeper they sank. Within seconds, the panzer was stuck fast, tilted at an awkward angle, its tracks churning uselessly in mud that had the consistency of wet concrete. Beck couldn't believe it. The ground had looked completely solid. Even now, looking around, the surface still looked solid. But beneath that deceptive crust was a layer of saturated clay mixed with standing water, deep enough to swallow a tank's tracks and thick enough to hold them there. Behind him, 3 more panzers had followed his path into the field. All 3 were now stuck, their tracks buried, their commanders shouting orders that accomplished nothing. Richter watched this unfold with growing disbelief. For tanks stuck in what had looked like perfect tank country. It made no sense. He radioed Beck. "What's your status?" "Sir, we're stuck in mud. It's deep, very deep. We can't get traction. The ground looked solid but it's not. It's a bog." Richter stared at the field. From his vantage point on the road, it still looked perfectly normal. He could see a farmhouse on a small hill, a barn, some outbuildings. The wheat in the field was green and healthy. There was no visible water. But 4 of his tanks were stuck. "Can you back out?" "Negative, sir. The mud has us. We need recovery vehicles." This was unacceptable. Richter ordered the column to halt while he assessed the situation. Other officers gathered around, studying the field, trying to understand what had happened. One of them, Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt, walked carefully to the edge of the field and knelt down. He pressed his hand against the ground. It felt firm. He stood and took a single step onto what looked like solid earth. His boot immediately sank 6 inches into mud. Schmidt jumped back, startled. He knelt again and examined the surface more carefully. What he'd mistaken for solid ground was actually a thin crust of dried earth and grass roots, maybe 3 inches thick, floating on top of a much deeper layer of saturated soil. It was a perfect trap. Invisible from any distance, solid enough to fool anyone on foot, but completely incapable of supporting the weight of a tank. Schmidt walked along the edge of the field, testing the ground every few meters. The entire low-lying area, at least 200 meters across and stretching for several hundred meters along their intended path, was the same. A bog disguised as farmland. He reported back to Richter. "Sir, the entire field is impassable. We'll need to recover those 4 panzers and find an alternate route." Richter stared at the stuck tanks, at the innocent-looking field, at the farmhouse on its little hill. This was impossible. The map showed solid ground here. The field looked solid. But it wasn't. He made a decision. Get the recovery vehicles forward. We'll pull those panzers out and continue on the main road. Tell battalion we've hit an obstacle. But recovering the stuck tanks proved harder than anyone expected. The first recovery vehicle that tried to approach got stuck itself. A second managed to get a tow cable attached to one of the stranded panzers, but when it tried to pull, its own tracks began to sink. The mud wasn't just deep. It was sticky, heavy, clinging to everything it touched. The more they tried to free the trapped vehicles, the more vehicles got stuck. By noon, 11 panzers and 3 recovery vehicles were mired in Pierre Mercier's fields. The advance had stopped completely. And in the barn on the hill, Pierre Mercier watched through a crack in the wall, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. The delay cascaded backward through the German advance like dominoes falling in slow motion. The 9th Panzer Division's lead battalion was stuck. The units behind them had to halt while engineers figured out how to recover the trapped vehicles. Artillery units trying to move forward found the road blocked by stationary panzers. Supply trucks backed up for kilometers. What should have been a 20-minute detour through open country had turned into an hours-long nightmare. Richter sent reconnaissance teams to scout alternate routes, but the geography of the valley worked against him. The Dyle River wound through the lowlands in a series of bends, and the only solid ground for crossing was either along the main road, which was clogged with refugees and burning debris from earlier fighting, or through a narrow pass 3 kilometers to the north, which would add hours to their journey. Meanwhile, the Belgians and British forces that had been retreating so desperately got something they desperately needed: time. Time to establish defensive positions along the rivers to the west. Time to bring up reserves. Time to organize what had been a chaotic retreat into something resembling a coordinated defense. The German High Command was furious when reports of the delay reached them. How had an entire panzer battalion been stopped by mud? What kind of incompetence allowed this to happen? The answers were frustrating because they revealed how little anyone had anticipated this problem. The maps showed solid ground. Aerial reconnaissance had shown solid ground. Every piece of intelligence suggested the Dyle River Valley was perfect tank country. Nobody had accounted for a farmer who knew his land better than any map or photograph could show. Nobody had imagined someone would deliberately flood his own fields to create a trap. It wasn't a reasonable thing to do. It was economic suicide. The flooding would destroy crops and ruin the land for years. What kind of person would do that? The kind of person who had nothing left to lose except the satisfaction of making the enemy pay for every meter they took. By late afternoon, German engineers had finally managed to construct a corduroy road of logs and planks across the wettest sections of the bog. They recovered 8 of the stuck panzers, though 3 were so deeply mired they had to be abandoned temporarily. The battalion was able to continue its advance, but they'd lost 6 critical hours. 6 hours during which the Allied forces west of the Dyle had transformed from a fleeing mob into something that looked like a defensive line. When the 9th Panzer Division finally reached Wavre that evening, they found British troops dug in and waiting for them. The easy advance was over. From this point forward, every kilometer would have to be taken by force. The delay caused by one farmer's desperate gamble hadn't stopped the German invasion. But it had slowed it down just enough to change the tactical situation from pursuit to battle. And sometimes, in war, that's all the difference in the world. Pierre Mercier watched the Germans finally leave his property as the sun began to set. They'd spent hours trying to recover their vehicles, cursing and shouting in a language he didn't understand. He'd stayed hidden in his barn, barely breathing, certain they would search for whoever was responsible and shoot him the moment they found him. But they never came looking. Perhaps they assumed the bog was natural. Perhaps they were too focused on their own problems to care about finding someone to blame. Or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine that a single farmer could have done this deliberately. When the last German soldier finally left his property, Pierre emerged from his hiding place. He walked slowly down to his fields, or what remained of them. The land he'd spent his life caring for was destroyed. The wheat was trampled and drowned. The irrigation ditches were broken. Tank tracks had torn great gouges in the earth. 3 German tanks remained, abandoned in the deepest mud, their hatches open, their engines silent. They looked like dead animals, mired and helpless. Pierre sat down on a broken section of wall and put his head in his hands. He'd won something, but the cost was everything he had. His farm was ruined. His life's work was destroyed. And for what? The Germans were gone, but they'd just gone around. They were still advancing. Belgium was still being conquered. What difference had he really made? He didn't know the answer. Wouldn't know for years. But 3 kilometers west, British and Belgian troops were digging in along prepared defensive positions they'd had 6 extra hours to fortify. Artillery pieces were being moved into place. Machine gun nests were being sandbagged. Commanders were coordinating fields of fire. And when the German advance resumed that evening, instead of catching a disorganized retreat, they ran headlong into prepared defenses. The battle that followed was brutal. The British held for 2 days before finally being forced to fall back. But 2 days was enough to evacuate thousands of civilians. Enough to move supplies and equipment. Enough to establish the next defensive line further west. The retreat continued, but it was no longer a rout. The Allies were still losing ground, but they were selling it at a price now. Making the Germans pay for every meter. And it had all begun with 6 hours of delay caused by one farmer who refused to let his land fall into enemy hands without a fight. Pierre Mercier's story didn't become famous. How could it? He never reported what he'd done. He spent that night hiding in the ruins of his barn, then walked west the next morning to try to find his wife and sons. He survived the war, though one of his sons didn't. He returned to his farm in 1945 to find it had been fought over twice more, first when the Germans retreated through the valley in 1944, then again during the final Allied advance. Nothing remained. The farmhouse was rubble. The barn was burned. The fields were cratered by artillery shells and littered with the debris of war. He was 58 years old by then, too old to start over. He sold the land to a younger farmer and moved to Brussels to live with his surviving son. He died in 1961, his obituary mentioning only that he'd been a farmer who lost his property during the war. The 3 abandoned German tanks remained in his fields until 1947, when a Belgian salvage crew finally recovered them. By that time they were half buried in mud, covered in rust, their serial numbers barely readable. Nobody remembered why they were there. Nobody asked. Belgium was full of abandoned vehicles from the war. 3 stuck tanks in a farmer's field were hardly remarkable. It wasn't until the 1970s that a military historian studying the German advance through Belgium noticed the unexplained 6-hour delay in the 9th Panzer Division's records. Curious about what could have stopped an entire armored battalion, he began investigating. He interviewed surviving German officers. He examined after-action reports. He looked at maps and photographs. And eventually, through careful detective work, he pieced together what had happened. A farmer had flooded his own fields, deliberately creating a trap that stopped a tank column. The historian published a paper about it in a minor military journal. A few other researchers cited it. And then the story faded back into obscurity. Because that's how most acts of resistance during World War II ended. Not with recognition or celebration, but with silence and forgetting. The great battles are remembered. The famous generals and decisive moments get the history books and the monuments. But the war was also fought by 10,000 individual acts of courage and desperation that nobody recorded, performed by ordinary people whose names were never written down. Pierre Mercier was one of millions. A farmer who made a choice. Who refused to accept the inevitable. Who did something ridiculous and desperate that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. The Germans invaded Belgium in May 1940 with overwhelming force. They conquered the country in 18 days. Nothing Pierre did change that outcome. Belgium still fell. The British Expeditionary Force still had to evacuate from Dunkirk. France still surrendered. But wars aren't won or lost in single moments. They're won in the accumulation of small advantages, the aggregation of minor delays, the compound interest of resistance that makes every advance a little harder and every victory a little more costly. Pierre's 6-hour delay didn't stop the invasion. But it bought time. Time for soldiers to prepare. Time for civilians to evacuate. Time for commanders to coordinate what became the defense at Dunkirk, where 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated instead of being captured or killed. How many of those 338,000 would have been captured if the German advance had been 6 hours faster? Impossible to say. But some number, perhaps thousands, owed their lives to an old Belgian farmer who knew how to turn his land into a trap. This is the truth about resistance that's hard to accept. Most of the time, it doesn't look heroic. It looks like futility. Like destroying your own livelihood to delay the enemy by a few hours. Like making choices that seem pointless in the moment and only reveal their meaning in retrospect, if at all. The Germans who got stuck in Pierre's fields probably cursed him without ever knowing who he was. The British soldiers who gained 6 extra hours to prepare their defenses never knew why. The civilians who escaped west while the German advance stalled didn't know they owed their lives to a flooded farm field they never saw. That's the nature of this kind of courage. It operates in silence and obscurity, making small differences that ripple forward in ways that can't be measured or recognized. Today, the land where Pierre Mercier's farm once stood is mostly forest. In the decades after the war, as Belgium rebuilt and modernized, the old farming communities along the Dyle River gradually emptied. Young people moved to the cities. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries returned to wilderness. If you know where to look, you can still find traces. Sections of stone wall buried in underbrush. The outline of old irrigation ditches now filled with moss and ferns. A concrete foundation where a farmhouse once stood, slowly being consumed by roots and thyme. And in the lowest part of the valley, where the ground is still too wet to support trees, there's a small clearing covered in marsh grass. In certain light, you can see the depressions where tanks once sat mired in mud, their tracks churning uselessly against the Belgian earth. Nobody visits. Why would they? There's no monument, no plaque. The story is forgotten except in a few obscure military histories that researchers occasionally cite. But the land remembers. The springs that Pierre's grandfather tried to drain still flow. The river still bends through the valley the way it has for thousands of years. And in wet springs, the low field still floods, turning briefly back into the swamp it always wanted to be. Pierre Mercier did something that made no strategic sense, that destroyed everything he built, that barely slowed an advance that would have succeeded regardless. He was one man against the mechanized might of the Wehrmacht. One farmer with nothing but water and mud against the most sophisticated military machine the world had ever seen. And for 6 hours, the mud won. That's not the ending you'd choose if you were writing fiction. In fiction, the farmer's plan would work perfectly. The entire German invasion would be stopped. The Belgians would counterattack. The war would turn on this moment. But real life doesn't work that way. Real resistance during World War II rarely changed the outcome of battles. It just made those battles harder. Made the occupation more difficult. Made victory more expensive. Pierre didn't stop the German invasion. He just made it a little bit slower. A little bit more difficult. A little bit more costly in time and equipment and momentum. And when you're fighting against overwhelming force with no hope of victory, making the enemy pay for every meter of ground is sometimes all you can do. The question that historians still debate is whether these small acts of resistance, multiplied by thousands across occupied Europe, actually mattered. Did they change the course of the war? Or were they just futile gestures that cost the people who made them everything while accomplishing nothing? The answer depends on what you think matters. If you believe only the great battles and strategic decisions matter, then Pierre's story is just a footnote. An interesting anecdote about a day when some tanks got stuck in mud. But if you believe that war is made up of 10,000 small moments, each one adding weight to one side or the other, then Pierre's 6 hours mattered as much as any battle. The soldiers who escaped at Dunkirk went on to fight in other battles. They trained new recruits. They passed on experience and tactics. Some of them participated in the D-Day landings 4 years later. The ripples from their survival spread forward through time in ways that can't be calculated but were nonetheless real. How much of that traced back to 6 hours of delay on a spring day in Belgium? Impossible to say. Probably not much. Probably nothing. But then again, maybe everything. Maybe the war was won not just at Stalingrad and Normandy and Berlin, but also in 10,000 forgotten moments like this one. In the aggregation of small resistances that made occupation harder, that preserved Allied forces for future battles, that bought time measured in hours that somehow accumulated into victory. That's the uncomfortable truth about resistance during World War II. Most of it was futile. Most of it failed. Most of the people who tried to resist were killed or captured, their efforts accomplishing nothing except their own destruction. But some resistance succeeded, at least partially. And you never knew which efforts would matter and which wouldn't. So you made the choice anyway. You did what you could with what you had, even when what you had was just mud and water and knowledge of your own land. Pierre Mercier made that choice. He flooded his fields and destroyed his livelihood and ruined his life's work to delay an army for 6 hours. And somewhere in those 6 hours, in the time that Allied soldiers gained to prepare defenses and evacuate civilians and coordinate resistance, there were consequences that rippled forward through the rest of the war in ways that nobody could track or measure but were nonetheless real. That's what makes his story matter. Not because he was a hero. Not because he won. Not because his story has a satisfying ending. But because he was just one person who refused to let impossibility stop him from trying, who did something ridiculous when reasonable options had all run out, who turned his land into a weapon because it was the only weapon he had. The German War Diaries from May 1940 record the delay matter-of-factly. Battalion encountered unexpected terrain difficulties. Advance resumed after recovery operations completed. 8 words to describe what happened. No mention of who caused it or why. But those 8 words represented 6 hours. 6 hours during which the world didn't end quite as quickly as it might have. 6 hours during which people escaped and soldiers prepared and small advantages accumulated. 6 hours purchased with everything one farmer had. That's not the kind of victory that gets you in history books. But it's the kind that gets you through another day, gets some people to safety, gets the war one step closer to the ending you're fighting for, even if you'll never live to see it. Pierre Mercier went to his grave not knowing if anything he did mattered. That's the hardest part of resistance. You rarely get to see the consequences of your choices. You just make the choice and live with the cost and hope that somewhere, somehow, it made a difference. The old German tanks in his field were finally recovered in 1947 and melted down for scrap. The stone from his farmhouse was carried away for use in other buildings. The land returned to forest, and Pierre's name was forgotten. But the springs still flow. The river still bends through the valley. And every spring, when the snow melts and the rain comes, that low field still floods, turning briefly back into the trap that once stopped a tank division. The land remembers, even if people don't. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone can really hope for when they make the choice to resist. That somewhere in the accumulated weight of 10,000 small acts of courage, in the aggregation of individual choices to fight back even when fighting seems hopeless, there's enough combined force to shift the balance of history 1 degree at a time. Pierre Mercier was one person. One farmer. One ridiculous idea in a moment of desperation. But for 6 hours, against the most powerful military machine in the world, it worked. And sometimes 6 hours is all it takes to change everything.